Yes, good afternoon. Today is Thursday, October the 29th, and we are rapidly ending the month of October and moving into the very short month of November, followed by the even shorter month of December. Which is really something when you think about it, considering the fact that we have a lot of territory to cover. So let's get started then today talking about this age of science. Hopefully, you took the time to look at the picture of me and my friend Nicholas Copernicus that I took in Warsaw, Poland. Love Poland. Anyway, so let's get down to business. Yes, there he is. A lot of this we'll go over really fast. So, Rene Descartes, so the so called father of modern rationalism, with his saying, cognito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am, which once again, uh, he founded an entire line of thought of rationalism. Meaning, you say, what does that mean? Well, the whole theme of the Enlightenment is that you should question everything. But if you question everything, how can you be sure of anything? Anything. For example, you say, well, I can be sure of my senses. How do you know your senses are accurate? Well, in the end, he finally came up with this cognito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. He said, basically, if I am thinking, then that must mean that I exist. And from that, he builds an entire body of philosophy, way of thinking. His books were placed on the RCC, Roman Catholic Church, index of books. And I'm sure that Mr. Arlinghouse can tell me what the index is. It's found in the District Messenger every Sunday. I'm sure you get that, right, Mr. Arlinghouse? The index is a list of forbidden media today, movies, books, whatever, music. Back then, it was just a list of books primarily. All right, Roman 14. The thinkers of this period championed something called the scientific method. Once again, you're not supposed to accept anything uh, on its face value. Just because somebody told you something is true doesn't mean that it's true. According to the Enlightenment, you question, you find out for yourself. Francis Bacon was an English scientist who fathered empiricism, which is basically the scientific method of first coming up with a thesis. Thesis, in other words, meaning that you make an observation, you make a guess as to why A plus B equals C, or something like that. You see, that in January there is snowfall, and then you test, you keep records over several Januaries, and although last January we didn't really get a snowfall, but over several Januaries. And then at the end, you make a generalization, you make a statement, you make a conclusion. Thesis, test, conclusion. How did Bacon die? And I think I went over this before. I don't know why. But yeah, Bacon died by experimenting with the process, with the idea, doing an experiment with the idea of whether or not cold temperatures can preserve meat. And he died because he stayed out in a very cold night stuffing chicken carcasses with snow. The experiment was a success, but he caught a chill, and of course, they probably bled him, and he died. All right, Roman numeral 15. Because of the printing press and scientific societies, scientific knowledge begins to mushroom and blossom. The French society collected tools and machines that were new so-called inventions. But once again, remember that at this time, research for research's sake, knowledge for knowledge's sake, was still way on the back burner. Most people wanted to know, how can I make this pay money? How can I use this to build things? Ah, so the British Society investigated technological improvements for industry. These societies also produced scientific journals for its reading public, which was composed mainly of other scientists, meaning that most of the people who read these journals, these scientific journals, were other people who were interested in it. In other words, these kind of things did not make it into the rank and file. Most people didn't see the benefit of it. Roman rule 16. Science began to be valued because certain interests, such as the textile industry in Great Britain, for example, saw the possibility for profiteering from new knowledge. Also, political groups sought scientific backing for their various agendas. And these groups were, this is just nicknames for these political groups in England. Levelers, diggers, ranchers, they were radicalist type political groups. And these names didn't last too long. Roman 17, whenever I kind of mumble over something like that, it means it's not going to be in your test. The age of science brought about a renewal of the debate between science and religion, which is a debate still goes on today. Benedict de Spinoza was an excommunicated Amsterdam Jew who rejected Descartes' ideas about the nature of man and God. He wrote a book called Ethics, which was a book that said that God is nature, meaning that it was a denial of God as a religious being, but that God is kind of like the force, in everything. Roman 18, Blaise Pascal, and I know I saw a test question about him. Blaise Pascal was an accomplished French scientist, mathematician who sought to keep God and science united. Yes, he invented a calculating machine. It was very large, very clunky, but it could do simple arithmetic computations, adding, subtracting, those kind of things. He also wrote Pensies, which were his notes for a book that was to be an apology for the Christian religion. And we'll talk more about that later. The attitude of the Enlightenment thinkers towards organized faith in Christianity. Good afternoon, Mr. DeMaria. Always happy to see you. Okay, in Pensies, Blaise Pascal, tried to appeal to the rationalists in both their reason and their emotions. He said that God is a reasonable bet, meaning that if God exists and we do the things that God wants us to, then we win. But if he does not exist, then we still win because we've just been a nice person. Did you get that? Yeah. Pascal, in the end, relied more on faith. He said that reason can only take one so far. Pascal and the others failed to reconcile faith and reason as Europe continued to become more and more secular. See, those are the kinds of things you keep in mind for an AP exam. That the Enlightenment, the age of science, you see Europe becoming more and more secular to the very point where today church membership in Europe has fallen through the floor. And I've probably said this before, but when I go to Europe, and I love to go to Europe, when I go to Europe, I always, whatever town I'm in, I always make sure to visit the biggest church because these churches are works of art. And what you find in those churches is that you have to pay money to walk through them. But if you want to go worship, you'd be pretty much alone. Yeah, interesting. I think I did tell you the story of when I visited St. Paul's Cathedral. St. Paul's Cathedral, which is the biggest church in England, designed by Christopher Wren. We went there, Wes and I did, on a Saturday afternoon. It was right about 5 o'clock or maybe 6 o'clock. I don't know. Point of the matter was it was at the very end of the Saturday service. And so we wanted to tour, go inside. They held us up from going inside. And I'm telling you, me being the ugly tourist, you guys know me, the ugly tourist, I didn't go in and take pictures during the service. Thank you so much. But I looked around, and I'm telling you, St. Paul's Cathedral in London is cavernous. It is immense. It is huge. And I looked down an empty aisle, and I could barely see because you're looking at about the length of a football field on the inside. And in the very end, up close to the altar, there were maybe 15 people in a church like that. And there I was standing in line with people who had paid £18 to see this, to pay to walk in there. The ones who went for free, but you had to worship. Anyway, interesting. So the point of the matter is Europe became more and more secular. Okay. Now I joined these two units. We're going away from the age of science, and now we're into the age of the Enlightenment. Age of Enlightenment, you're looking at a period of time, well, from the 17th century to the beginning of the 19th century. So during the 18th century, the idea that economic change and political reform were both possible and desirable began to spread and become popular. Yeah, what does that mean, Mr. Horton? And see, I mean, these two ideas that I just talked about here are things that we assume today. That economic change, in other words, you can become more wealthy, you can gain income, you can improve your standing in life, and political reform. You can live in a country that has a government that is better. That those both things were both possible and also desirable began to spread. It became a popular idea. This combined confidence in the human mind and human enterprise, inspired by the scientific revolution, and faith in the power of rational criticism to challenge the intellectual authority of tradition and the Christian past. What? Basically, it meant that by using logic, by using reasoning, you could question the way things had been done, even in the established churches. And so, yeah, to challenge the intellectual authority and tradition and the Christian past. They, the Enlightenment thinkers, felt that human beings could comprehend the operation of physical nature and mold it to the ends of material and moral improvement, economic growth, and political reform. Okay, so swallow that entire statement. Comprehend the operation of physical nature. In other words, to understand that the lions eat the antelope, the lions die and become the grass, and then the antelope eat the grass. In other words, and that the earth revolves around the sun, the moon revolves around the earth, and all the planets in perfect harmony. Circle of life, Simba. So you can understand that. And then mold that knowledge to the ends of material and moral improvement. In other words, by having knowledge, you could make your life better. You could make more money, and you could build a better government. Okay? These are the themes of the Enlightenment. The writers and critics who forged the new attitudes favorable to change, who championed reform, and who flourished in the emerging print culture, more and more books and magazines and newspaper. We're called, as a group, the Philosophs. Okay? Philosophs, who were they? Today we'd call them smart guys. Today we'd call them scientists. Today we'd call them scholars. You see? People who tried to apply logic and reasoning and intelligence to everything, which is their weakness. Anyway, they sought to apply the rules of reason and common sense to nearly all the major institutions and social practices of their day, and that was their weakness. Because some things do not square with logic. Some things cannot be explained with logic. And I'm not talking about ghosts and goblins. I am talking about particularly the human condition, anger, um, vengeance, remorse, religion, a number of things. But anyway, back to the matter at hand. The most famous were Voltaire, the Baron de Montesquieu, Denis Diderot, Jacques d'Alembert, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Gordon Hume, Sir Edward Gibbon, Smith Lessing, and Immanuel Kant. These people could be found in the following places. As it says there, a few could be found at universities. You have to remember that the universities of the 18th century were not research institutions like today. Today, all major universities are one of their goals is research. You go to UK, and they have a research wing. You go to UK, they have a research agricultural wing, for example, that does research and experiments. In the 18th century, no, universities were places where people went to learn and get an education, and that was it. Others, and more often, could be found in drinking holes, taverns, coffee houses, social gathering spots. Let's throw in a word here. That word is the salons. And yes, it is spelled like the one like you're going to fix your hair, but that's not what it was for. The salons, particularly popular in France, particularly in Paris, where people would go drink alcohol and sit around and talk about ideas, the Enlightenment, reform. And, once again, you might sit there and think, well, that sounds really dumb. But you got to remember that people do different things at different times. And this was the way that people recreated themselves. In Eastern Europe, they, meaning these Philosophs, might be found in the royal bureaucracies. They, meaning the Philosophs as a group, were not an organized group. And also, they, the Philosophs, did not agree on many issues. Yeah. There was no organized, current of thought much during the Enlightenment. They just all agreed that the human condition can be improved, and it can be improved using this thing right here, using the intellect, using reason. Look what it says. Their chief bond was their desire to reform society, reform thought and government for the sake of human liberty. Yeah. Notice, and this comes from a quote from the Philosophs, freedom from arbitrary power. That means the freedom from a government that can do to you whatever it wants to do to you, whenever it wants to do to you. Basically, it means freedom from the divine rights of kings. Freedom of speech, freedom of trade, freedom to realize one's own talents, freedom of aesthetic, that means beautiful, artistic response, freedom, here it is, of moral man to make his way in the world. And we underline this. No other single set of ideas. No other single set of ideas has done so much to shape the modern world. And that is quite true. I mean, the Enlightenment became so much a part of our psyche that we don't even know it anymore. The idea that depend on the science, the idea that, new is better, the idea that research can produce improvements. And you say, well, haven't people always been like that? Not really. Not really. In the period before this time, a lot of people looked with great suspicion on scientists. Much of what the Philosophs understood as freedom challenged established thought in religion. Yes. Because the Philosophs, remember, as a group, really thought that organized religion was a great enslaver of mankind. The Philosophs embraced many of the changes in agriculture and industry The philosophers, were intellectual, but they were also deeply in touch with everyday life, and intellectuals read by people who wished to transform everyday life. The philosophers, used the print culture to spread their ideas, whether it be through the Enlightenment Encyclopedia or through newspapers. They employed the printed word to declare a new faith, not in God, but in the capacity of humankind to improve itself without the aid of God. Much of the readership, people who read about the Philosophs, were people who had enough money and wherewithal to not only buy books, to be able to sit down and read them, have the time. The Philosophs, worked to expose contemporary social and political abuses and argued that reform was necessary and possible. In other words, these were the crusaders for freedom. Remember that the thought of the Enlightenment will be one of the inspirations that kicks off the American Revolution. Remember that our good friend Thomas Jefferson plagiarized John Locke when he wrote the Declaration of Independence. Yeah, we'll talk about that later on, but I'm telling you, Thomas Jefferson had written the Declaration of Independence and turned it into your modern European history class teacher. He'd have got an F because he plagiarized it. But that's another story. In the second half of this 18th century, the philosophers, became more and more specific and began arguing with each other and became more concerned, I'm going to yawn, with politics than religion. The philosophers were certain that human society could be reformed, but were uncertain as to whether or not that improvement was certain or even permanent. Okay, that's hard to swallow. First of all, philosophers they knew that you can reform society using logic, using reason, but they did not know whether or not that would actually happen, or if it did happen, the change would be permanent. Verstehen Sie das, n'est-ce pas? Okay. Many influences brought on this age of enlightenment. Number one, the Newtonian worldview. The influence of the book by Isaac Newton. And I can't remember what that name of that book is. So Isaac Newton and John Locke were the major forerunners in the Enlightenment. John Locke wrote his essay on human understanding. Isaac Newton's formulation of the law of universal gravitation, and it says, does it still hold true? Answer, no. No. Here's something. Isaac Newton, in his theory of universal gravitation, says that gravity works in a straight line. It pulls things directly to the center of the earth. Albert Einstein came along and said, not so fast, Isaac, that gravitation actually works as a curve. How he figured that out, I have no idea. So his theory of universal gravitation showed the power of the human mind. He encouraged the direct study of nature to avoid metaphysics and supernaturalism. In other words, to avoid this explanation that things are magical. It's the will of the gods. You have sinned, therefore this is happening to you. If nature was rational, he said, then society should also be rational. In his book, An Essay Concerning Human Understanding, John Locke insists that man is born tabula rasa, or blank slate. And see, this is a major change from the thinking of the pre-Enlightenment days. Prior to this, the intelligentsia of Europe thought that when the common man was born, that he was some kind of an animal. Remember what Thomas Hobbes said. Thomas Hobbes said, without the strong rule of the state, life would be nasty, brutish, and short. John Locke says, no, man is tabula rasa, that man is innately good, and man can make himself into a good, upstanding individual. Man, he said, is formed by his surroundings. Change the surroundings, change the man. Environment, not genetics, is the determiner of human beings. He rejected the Christian view that humans were permanently flawed by sin. Britain, oh, look at this. I think I sense another short answer question in here. Britain was viewed by the Enlightenment thinkers as the example of a society that could be reformist and could work. Yeah, you need to make note of this, is that most of the Enlightenment thinkers thought that Great Britain exemplified what an ideal society was. Now, they were wrong. They had most of Europe looked upon Britain as this kind of a paradise where everything had been set right. Because, as it says there, Britain did allow religious pluralism, more than one religion, although they discriminated against Catholics, which, of course, to most of the Enlightenment thinkers in Europe, that was fine. Britain did have relative freedom of the press and religion. And in Britain, the courts prevented citizens from arbitrary seizure and arrest, meaning that, you couldn't just come along and snatch. The police couldn't come along and just break into your house and take from you and put you in jail in Great Britain. They had the right of habeas corpus. This arrangement had to idealist observers on the continent produce stability, prosperity, and a loyal citizenry. And so, yeah, all they're saying there is, the Philosophs had an overinflated idea of what the British were like. I'm looking at the clock because I'm going to end soon. France needed to reform in many ways, even though France was the birthplace and the hotbed of the Enlightenment. Why? Louis XIV had left the legacy of a large army, which, of course, as we already know, large armies were primarily used more so to suppress the population than to actually defend the borders. Louis XIV had left the legacy of an absolute monarchy. Yes, the Sun King and the divine rights of kings. Heavy taxation on primarily the Third Estate, religious persecution on the Huguenots, and his successors continued to curb liberties. Louis XV and Louis XVI, who were weaker and weaker monarchs, but they supported their grandfathers' ideas about suppressing people's individual rights. However, France was the center of the Enlightenment. Ah, yes. Who was Francois Marie Aurier? His name is there, Voltaire. Voltaire was imprisoned for criticizing the government. However, he visited England. He was actually criticized a couple of times because he wrote things criticizing the government. However, on the other hand, he had a designated seat in the court of Frederick the Great of Prussia. But in his own France, he got thrown in jail a couple of times because he mouthed off about the government. He visited England to observe toleration. He published his books, Letters on the English, which were his observations that praised the virtues of English society and indirectly criticized the abuses of French societies. He also wrote Elements of the Philosophy of Newton, which popularized the thoughts of Isaac Newton. But notice what it says. Very clever. He spent most of his life living on the Swiss border because what he would do, he would write something that was risque, critical of the government, and if he found out that the government got mad about it, he would just hop over the border into Switzerland and stay there until the heat was off and continue to write as he always did. In his play, Candide, which is actually very famous, he attacked war, religious persecution, and what he regarded as the unwarranted optimism about the human condition. The Enlightenment was the first movement to exist in a print culture where the printed word was so available to so many people. Yeah, see, that was the first time that had ever happened, where you have so much printed material floating around. And while don't get the idea that everybody could read, because they couldn't, but they could go to a tavern and somebody there could read, and that's how they would read newspapers. They go to a tavern and somebody could read, and they'd buy that somebody the newspaper, and he'd sit there and read it out loud, and everybody would listen to it. So, although printed books provided a new resource, most messages though were spread directly by preaching. The volume of printed materials increased sharply, and prose is like essays. Prose is like, well, written stories. Prose came to be valued as much as poetry and, underlined because on the test, the novel emerged as a distinct form of writing for the first time. It had never appeared before for several reasons. Number one, there was never a novel before because most people really didn't have the time to read a novel. And there weren't that many people who could read. But yeah, the novel emerged as a distinct form of writing. The printed word had become the chief vehicle for communication of ideas that would remain so until somebody invented texting or television, the electronic revolution. Towards the end of the 17th century, half, a good stats here, towards the end of the 17th century, half of all books were religious. But by the end of the 18th century, only 10% were. That is a revealing stat about the secular nature of Europe. See? Books were not inexpensive, but did manage to reach a wider and wider audience. I mean, yeah, when we began studying this unit in the Renaissance, most people not only could not read, um, and of course could not own a book. Most people in 1450 in Europe had never seen a book. But now books were becoming much more plentiful, but they were still expensive for people. I mean, remember the fact that Abraham Lincoln used to walk for miles to borrow a book from the library. And so, yeah, books and knowledge of books and knowledge of books began to be associated with good taste and the aristocracy and the money class. Authorship, the writing of books, became an occupation, and a division soon emerged between high and low literacy culture. The new print culture soon spread the Enlightenment ideas to all parts of society. Now, okay, we'll finish this. Look what I wrote in all caps there. If I wrote it in all caps there, you know it's important. The expanding literate public, in other words, more people could read, and the growing influence of secular printed materials created a new and increasingly influential social force called public opinion, which had never existed before, that the public would have a thinking, an opinion about things that were going on. As it says there, public opinion seems not to have existed before the middle of the 18th century. And while Abraham Lincoln has yet to be born, what did Abraham Lincoln say about public opinion? It's a good saying. With public opinion on your side, nothing is impossible. Without it, nothing can be done. Good quote, I think. Governments could no longer operate wholly in secret or with disregard to the larger public sphere. Even the absolute monarchies, even they could not just simply do whatever they wanted anymore because people would find out about it. People would read about it in the press, and people would react to it, even against the most autocratic of monarchies. The government, had to explain why they did things. Continental European governments sensed the political power of the new print culture. They regulated the book trade, censored books and newspapers, confiscated offending titles, and imprisoned authors who overstepped. So yeah, I mean, it wasn't like you were suddenly free to say anything you wanted, but the power of the printed word, the written word, was on the rise. But you still had to be careful. And we're going to stop there and talk about the Enlightenment Encyclopedia tomorrow. Thank you all very much.